Imagine living in a small medieval village, wooden houses crammed together, dirt streets, the constant smell of smoke and animals, a place where everyone knew everyone, and where a single whisper could destroy a life. Now imagine someone pointing a finger at you in the square. An accusation, maybe theft, maybe blasphemy, maybe just envy. And in that world, an accusation was almost always enough. There were no lawyers. There was no real investigation. And very often, there wasn't even a trial. Within a few hours, the news was already spreading through the entire village. The church bell rang. People abandoned their work. And slowly, as if they were going to watch a show, everyone began gathering in the central square. Old people, women, children, everyone wanted to see. Because in those times, justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about fear. You would be taken to the center of the square, surrounded by faces that might have been your neighbors, people who, just yesterday, shared bread with you. But now they were there to watch, to judge, to wait. And the most terrifying part of all, you didn't know exactly what was going to happen to you. No one explained the punishment in detail. No one said how long it would last. No one said whether you would come out alive. You just stood there, restrained, waiting. Minutes that felt like hours, hours that felt like days. And in that heavy silence, while the crowd murmured around you, something began to happen inside your own mind. Because the true terror of medieval justice didn't start when the pain arrived. It started much earlier. It started the moment you realized you no longer had any control over your own fate, that your life had now become nothing more than a spectacle for the crowd. And when the punishment finally began, it rarely attacked the body first. It attacked the mind. But what most people today don't realize is that some of these punishments were deliberately designed to destroy the human spirit long before ever touching the skin. And in the next part of the story, you're going to discover why, in the Middle Ages, justice had to be turned into a public spectacle of terror. So go ahead and leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because what happened in those medieval squares is going to make you see the word justice in a completely different way. And once you understand why entire crowds brought their families to watch these punishments, you'll realize it wasn't just punishment, it was something far darker. To understand the brutality of medieval punishments, you first need to understand one essential thing. Justice back then wasn't designed to uncover the truth. It was designed to maintain power. In most of medieval Europe, there was no organized judicial system like the one we know today. There were no clear legal codes. There were no independent courts. The fate of people was decided by feudal lords, local authorities, or representatives of the church. And very often, everything happened at a terrifying speed. An accusation arose. A brief interrogation was conducted, if one was conducted at all. And the sentence could come on the same day. But the most important point wasn't just to punish the accused. It was to make sure everyone saw the punishment. That's why almost all executions and punishments took place in public squares, in the center of the village, in the marketplace, or in elevated locations where everyone could watch. Because the more people saw, the more effective the fear would be. And the scene looked like something almost impossible to imagine today. Crowds gathered as if they were going to a festival. Entire families showed up. Parents brought small children by the hand. Teenagers climbed onto walls to get a better view. Old people settled onto makeshift benches. And the strangest part, there were even vendors, food being sold, drinks being offered, small merchants taking advantage of the crowd. For many people, watching a public punishment was a social event, something that broke the monotony of medieval life. As the condemned was led to the center of the square, the murmur of the crowd grew. Some watched in silence, others shouted insults, some even laughed. Because in that harsh and unpredictable world, watching another human being suffer created a strange sense of relief. Today, it's not me. And that was exactly what the authorities wanted. The punishment had to be seen. It had to be remembered. It had to become an image etched into the mind of every person in the village. Because when fear enters the mind of an entire society, it becomes the most efficient form of control. And that's why, even before any physical pain began, the punishment was already fulfilling its true purpose. It was teaching a lesson. not just to the condemned, but to everyone watching. But not all medieval punishments ended in death. In fact, some of the cruelest ones didn't even touch the body right away. They were created for something much deeper, to destroy the human spirit. One of the most common tools for this was the pillory, a simple wooden frame set up in the center of the village. There, the condemned had their hands and neck locked into tight holes, left completely immobilized, for hours, sometimes entire days, exposed in front of the whole community, unable to move, unable to defend themselves. And while the prisoner remained there, the crowd did the rest. Insults started to come, first a few words, then laughter, and then objects started flying. Food scraps, rotten fruit, garbage. Some people spat, others struck blows. And in certain places there were even specific instruments of humiliation, like the so-called mask of shame, a grotesque metal mask placed on the condemned person's face, often shaped in ridiculous ways, exaggerated noses, huge tongues, or deformed expressions. The intention was clear, to turn that person into a spectacle of ridicule in front of everyone. And the psychological effect was devastating, because physical pain can end, but public humiliation stays etched forever. Even when the prisoner was released, their life hardly ever returned to normal. Everyone in the village remembered, everyone knew, and the condemned carried something invisible but as heavy as a chain, the mark of shame. Many prisoners, after hours or days of exposure, began to beg for something that seemed unthinkable. They begged for death, because for some, dying would be easier than continuing to live with that humiliation. But what few people realize is that there were punishments even more disturbing, punishments that didn't last just hours, but entire days of carefully planned suffering. And when those methods began, it wasn't just the body that broke. It was the human mind itself that began to unravel. If public humiliation was already enough to break many people, some medieval punishments went far beyond that. They weren't made to end quickly, quite the opposite. They were carefully planned to last as long as possible. The goal wasn't just to cause pain, it was to slowly destroy the condemned person's mind. In some towns, prisoners were placed in iron cages, suspended, hung from walls or trees near the village entrance. There, the condemned was exposed to the wind, the cold, the heat of the sun, and the constant gaze of everyone who passed by. Days could turn into weeks. No shelter, no comfort, no privacy whatsoever. People walked by, pointed, commented, and went on with their lives normally, while the prisoner slowly turned into a human shadow. In other places, the punishment took an even crueler form. Some condemned were placed in tiny spaces, so cramped they could barely move. They couldn't lie down, they couldn't stretch their legs, the body began to ache, muscles locked up. Circulation slowed, but the worst was yet to come. Because many of these methods included sleep deprivation. Guards woke the prisoner constantly, lights, shouts, shoves. Whenever the body tried to rest, something yanked it back to consciousness. And when a human being is deprived of sleep long enough, reality starts to fall apart. First comes confusion, then delusions, then hallucinations. Prisoners reported seeing people who weren't there, hearing voices, completely losing track of time. Some began talking to themselves, others simply stopped responding. It was as if something inside them had broken forever. Their identity began to disappear. The condemned stopped being a person and became just a body waiting for the end. That's why there are striking historical accounts of prisoners who did something seemingly unimaginable. They begged for execution. They begged for a quick death. Because at that point, as dying would be a release, but all this brutality wasn't just sadism. These punishments had a very clear purpose. And to understand that purpose, we need to look at something even bigger, because the suffering of a single condemned person was actually a message directed at the entire society. In the Middle Ages, social order was extremely fragile. There were no organized police forces. There were no modern investigative systems. Authority needed another way to maintain control, and that way was fear. Brutal punishments served as a permanent warning to the entire population. Every execution, every torture, every public humiliation was a silent message saying, "This could happen to you." And the most frightening part is that very often it really could, because accusations weren't always based on evidence. A suspicion was enough, a rumor, a denunciation made at the wrong moment. Peasants could be accused of theft, women could be accused of witchcraft, ordinary people could be accused of heresy or treason. And when the church or feudal lords began an investigation, the outcome was often already decided before the interrogation even started. Torture was used to extract confessions, but there was a cruel detail in that process. When someone is subjected to extreme pain long enough, they confess anything, even crimes they never committed, even completely made-up stories. Because in that moment, the human mind wants only one thing: for the pain to stop. And so false confessions became common. Innocent people were condemned, and the cycle of fear continued. But from the authorities' point of view, the system worked. The more brutal the punishment, the more obedient the population became. Peasants avoided questioning their lords. People avoided speaking too much. Neighbors watched each other with suspicion. The entire society began living under a constant shadow, a shadow created by something far more powerful than any written law: collective terror. But there is an even more disturbing question we need to ask. Why was such a cruel system considered necessary? Why did entire societies accept living under this kind of justice for centuries? The answer reveals something deeply unsettling about the medieval world, and perhaps about human power itself. After all this, an inevitable question arises. Why did medieval justice need to be so cruel? Why humiliate, torture, and destroy people in front of entire crowds? The answer begins with a simple and brutal reality. Medieval society was extremely unstable. There were no organized police forces patrolling cities. There were no scientific investigative systems. There were no complex courts analyzing evidence for months. Control of order depended on something far more primitive: fear. Rulers knew they didn't have enough structure to monitor every person, every village, every road. But if they could make a punishment seem terrible enough, the population itself would take care of maintaining order. It was a cold calculation. If 1,000 people witnessed a brutal punishment, perhaps none of them would dare challenge authority afterward. The punishment didn't need to reach only the condemned. It needed to reach the imagination of everyone else. That's why executions were public. That's why humiliations were prolonged. That's why the pain had to be memorable. The more shocking the punishment, the more powerful the message. And for centuries, that system worked. Entire kingdoms were governed that way. But when we look back today, something becomes impossible to ignore. Most of those punishments weren't really concerned with discovering the truth. They were concerned with protecting power, because when fear rules a society, questioning becomes dangerous, doubt becomes a threat, and justice turns into a tool of control. It was only many centuries later that new ideas began to emerge: legal rights, formal judicial processes, the presumption of innocence. Concepts that today seem basic, but that were won slowly, after generations who lived under far more brutal systems, and that leaves us with an unsettling reflection. When we look at medieval squares full of people watching punishments, it's easy to think that belonged to a distant past. But history shows something uncomfortable. Societies don't change overnight. They evolve slowly, often only after passing through dark periods. And perhaps that's why the final lesson of medieval justice is so powerful, because it reminds us that for centuries, thousands of people believed that was normal, that it was necessary, that it was justice. But looking back today, the truth seems impossible to deny. Medieval justice was not created to discover the truth. It was created to ensure no one dared challenge power.
Warning to any who challenge our authority. The king's justice is swift. Let this be a warning to any who challenge our authority.